Hello everyone, today we go on reading and commenting the second chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. The reason why the object deduced from the conception of war is not adapted in general to real war lies in the difference between the two, which is discussed in the preceding chapter. If it was as pure theory gives it, then a war between two states of very unequal military strength would appear an absurdity, therefore impossible. At most, the inequality between the physical forces might be such that it could be balanced by the moral forces, and that would not go far with our present social condition in Europe. Therefore, if we have seen wars take place between states of very unequal power, then it has been the case because there is a wide difference between war in reality and its original conception. There are two considerations which as motives may practically take the place of inability to continue the contest. The first is the improbability, the second is the excessive price of success. According to what we have seen in the foregoing chapter, war must always set itself free from the strict law of logical necessity, and seek aid from the calculation of probabilities. And as this is so much the more the case, the more the war has a bias that way from the circumstances out of which it has arisen, the smaller its motives are, and the excitement it has raised, so it is also conceivable how out of this calculation of probabilities even motives to peace may arise. War does not, therefore, always require to be fought out until one party is overthrown, and we may suppose that, when the motives and passions are slight, a weak probability will suffice to move that side to which it is unfavorable to give way. Now, were the other side convinced of this beforehand, it is natural that he would strive for this probability only, instead of first wasting time and effort in the attempt to achieve the total destruction of the enemy's army. Still more general in its influence on the resolution to peace is the consideration of the expenditure of force already made and further required. As war is no act of blind passion, but is dominated by the political object, therefore the value of that object determines the measure of the sacrifices by which it is to be purchased. This will be the case not only as regards extent, but also as regards duration. As soon, therefore, as the required outlay becomes so great that the political object is no longer equal in value, the object must be given up, and peace will be the result. We see, therefore, that in wars where one side cannot completely disarm the other, the motives to peace on both sides will rise or fall on each side according to the probability of future success and the required outlay. If these motives were equally strong on both sides, they would meet in the center of the political difference. Where they are strong on one side, they might be weak on the other. If their amount is only sufficient, peace will follow, but naturally to the advantage of that side which has the weakest motive for its conclusion. We purposely pass over here the difference which the positive and negative character of the political end must necessarily produce practically. For although that is, as we shall hereafter show, of the highest importance, still we are obliged to keep here to a more general point of view, because the original political views in the course of the war change very much, and at last may become totally different, just because they are determined by result and probable events. So, in this chapter, von Clausewitz essentially talks about the costs and benefits of war, and as the leading motives as of military action in itself, of the military choice, if you want. And he introduces it by recalling essentially what was said in the preceding chapter, from the general, what he calls the conception, so the abstract idea of war, and the real war, remembering us that, okay, we have explained that the reason why the object deduced from the conception of war is not adapted in general to real war lies in the difference between the two, which is discussed in the preceding chapter. So we don't have to repeat it, in other words. Then he says, if it was as pure theory gives it, so he continues along recalling us. So this is particularly important, that he also helps us during the work to remember what was said. So he never, leaves you on your own. He expects you to know what he has explained, but also it gives you this extra help that is, by the way, very intelligently immediately linked to the next step, right? So here it says, so if it was as pure theory gives it, right, so given the abstraction, then a war between two states of very unequal military strength would appear an absurdity, therefore impossible, because in that abstract conception we have seen a kind of an absolute capacity of the fighters to deliver their force. So and the same reason, actually, as we will see now, too. So essentially the strongest, the one who has more strength, even kind of physically meant, is the one that is gonna crush the other. And in this abstract conception of war, of course there wouldn't even be the need of a clash if this was the case, because everybody knew, would know actually immediately the what would the strength relations are, and there would not be need to fight. I'm strong 5, you're strong 3, I'm gonna crush you. That's simple. I will get to 2 at that point, but let's not go far at this point, because it's pure abstraction, right? Then it says, at most the inequality between the physical forces might be such that it could be balanced by the moral forces. So that, and that would not go far with our present social condition in Europe, by the way. So you could say, well, yeah, but there are also moral forces, so basically those could compensate the physical ones. And if you take this in the abstraction, you could say, okay, the greater the need, the strength basically I need is, let's say, the weaker I am, the more physically speaking, the stronger I have to be morally, right? So even in here, you could say, well, the two things could be balanced if there are enough moral resources at this point, but already this becomes an absurdity. And interestingly enough, von Clausewitz here recalls the social condition in Europe at this time. So even in a moment in which it was evident that moral forces were not something you could easily find out of nowhere without any motivation or reasons, etc. After the Napoleonic Wars and all that had happened, the regimes overthrown, the peoples exhausted, and the millions of soldiers spent out there and civilians killed, etc. So you can imagine, how this strength relations were seen, very pragmatic, were lived on the skin of people who have lived through them. So this is already a demonstration, actually not ex absurdo, but ex evidence, let's say, because that was something that even von Clausewitz considers as widely known at that point in history. And then it says, therefore, if we have seen wars take place between states of very unequal power, that has been the case because there is a wide difference between war in reality and its original conception that we will now. Essentially, in this passage, he repeats much of what he had already said, but we will now see that there is a kind of a different accent put, let's say an accent put on certain kind of newly formulated concepts. Then he says there are two considerations which as motives may practically take place of inability to continue the contest. The first is the improbability, the second is the excessive price of success. So he already identifies these two motives that can put a limit definitely to this otherwise absolute form of war. Let's remember that here absolute is not just is to be meant as unrestrained, right? So it's not really the absolute force just ideally meant, but also conditioned by something else, right? And so the first one is the improbability. In other words, as we've already seen in the first chapter, war cannot be waged just with a realistic calculation of what will happen. There is always a certain amount of unknown, and the best we can do is basically to identify the most accurate probability that something will go on and bet on it, right? That would succeed and bet on it. The second one is the excessive price, so the bet in itself. So there is something that you're fighting over, and you have to calculate whether it's worth it or not, especially given the chances, the probabilities of success. This is particularly important to see it. I mean, the gambling dimension of war actually as a game, because it explains a lot historically of how wars are, as victories and defeats actually come. This is important because I believe there is a tendency to consider war as something like we didn't have to go there. I personally got pretty much interested in certain conflicts, especially in the 20th century, that have left, at least in popular culture, this idea that that war it was impossible to be won, right? It was impossible to win. We should have never gone there. Should have never happened. It was a mistake. And sure, I mean, historically speaking, these mistakes are omnipresent. You can't say that they can't be erased, and that's exactly what, in part, von Clausewitz is telling us. But more poignantly, I believe that is also saying that there is a rational awareness of the improbability. I mean, the fact that you're essentially betting and gambling, and this is particularly important because it tells you that the odds are never fully favorable to you. Things can go bad, and this may not depend on just a mistake that is kind of overwhelming, but actually of the lack of even of possibility to have a clear picture of the situation, of to foresee the outcome of the war at the beginning. So I believe that it's very important civically and politically to consider this, not just as, the politicians brought us in that wreck and we should have not gone in there. Sometimes it is. Most of the times you always say, well, it depends really, but there is also this objective impossibility of figuring out what it will be, so that everything, and it happens not just in things, matter of government or wars, etc. It happens really in everyday life. Like in everyday life, you estimate something that it eventually turns out not to be the one, and actually you guessed, and that however you constantly change opinion about, so that you even need this form of approximation, because otherwise you'd be frozen. There would be no way to go on. You would simply, sitting there in the corner, fearful of everything that is happening all around you. You would not take action just because you don't fully know 100%. What does knowing mean in the first place? So in other words, naturally you can learn from your own mistakes, but it's also true that, and this is especially evident in a war, that the mistake is also quite dearly paid, and this can bring to a loss. Every war brings two losses, but there is the idea that that at least hopefully the gains should surpass the loss in itself. So these two elements, once again, the improbability and the excessive price. So here von Clausewitz is showing us actually the thing from a kind of a negative perspective, that this is what effectively holds you from far away actually from the absolute form of war. Because interestingly enough, von Clausewitz is not telling you that the absolute form of war is what you shouldn't do. He's telling you simply that it's not practicable. It's not real. So in other words, you should tendentially always to lean towards that side. So you should be able to concentrate your forces towards that direction and making the best to reduce, in fact, this ignorance fundamentally that you have towards the odds and how things will evolve, right? But von Clausewitz is telling you that in general, no matter what, this improbability and excessive price are always on your mind anyway, and they should be, rightfully so, because otherwise you could throw yourself into a disaster. And those are the things that are making you refrain and maybe to take more considerate action, but at the same time reducing the military action in itself, or even not even taking that. And this is a process that happens all the time in every sphere, both of government and of life. I mean, potentially we're all settled. We're all set to make use of violence. There is a theoretical realm where you say, if such an eventuality occurs, I have at least violence as a viable option to be exercised. So, but you evidently don't do it. We live in a world that is broadly peaceful. Even, biologically speaking, humans are not meant to actually be killing each other continuously. As a matter of fact, human beings tend just to taunt each other, to insult, through some rock, but always at a distance. And just among humans, among other animals, the actual outbreak of violence is pretty rare. Naturally, a war is something different because it's socially organized, it has a rational direction, so it is expected to take place with a higher degree of rationality, in fact, of calculated and risk, right? That should be usually wiser than the average decision, not just because it's taken socially, but also because a lot of things are at stake, and therefore, and in fact, at a social level, so a very big one that can determine whether your tribe gets annihilated or not. In other words, naturally, the more society grows complex and the more studying the system becomes complicated, but the essentials are always the same. And this is what von Clausewitz is teaching us. Okay, so then he goes on and says, according to what we have seen in the foregoing chapter, once again, war must always set itself free from the strict law of logical necessity and seek aid from the calculation of probabilities. So in other words, you may want to use your force to settle the matter radically and to get rid of the problem, but and this is a kind of a logical necessity. You should do it. You want to get rid of the problem, get it. You decided to use violence in the process, okay, but it's never quite simple to decide whether violence is needed in the process, and even when it occurs, it's difficult to bear it, to wage this fight, the same problem. And the reason is mainly this the calculation of probabilities. Probabilities help you, but at the same time they have to be calculated effectively, and they're just probabilities. I mean, they're not factual truth. They're not something you can measure. They're largely theoretical, in fact, and that's the bitter difference between theory and reality, because theory is just like a system that we have set to approximate what can happen, but what happens in reality is eventually determined by something that is kind of unique in its kind, right? It's like when you throw the dice. Say what kind of or throw a, because I don't know what's the name in English. Wait a second. That's kind of ridiculous. Okay. Whether it's odd number or even number, right? So let's assume you throw the dice, it's odd. Now, you would think that the chances now of having, you had 50-50 of possibilities, right? So you would think that now throwing the dice once again would more likely get to now getting an even number that you didn't have before. But it turns out every time you throw the dice, basically you have always the same chance. So we can track this kind of mathematical constant at the end of the day, because if you throw the dice continuously, it turns out that all the the odd and the even will balance out in following this kind of 50-50, and you can foresee that because it's a kind of obvious mathematical proportion. But the truth is that, you know, if on that dice throwing you're basically betting your own life, well, you know, at this point, well, of course you would hopefully wouldn't do it, but you realize that when the system you know, it doesn't really matter how many times you had tried before. At that point, what it matters is you have always that kind of possibility. And the same goes, and you can imagine how the problem is exponentially enlarged and dilated by such complex systems that nobody can even scope fundamentally, such like the social ones. They're the ones that entail war. But not only, it's just also about the physical awareness, right? You know, when you fight on a battlefield, you can assess what's kind of the most important thing, and this is what also von Clausewitz tells you should focus on. But you still don't have, you will never have, by biological default, the ability to actually understand how the whole thing is. Every single little, not even atom, but just, you know, the most little element is that you can even scope kind of with your senses. It is about on that place and how it can influence, and it's not even important. That's the point. That's not how we evolved naturally from the world. We're not programmed to take into consideration all the odds. We are just programmed to go there and kind of hope for the best on the base of this quite approximate calculation of probability, and to go on in this fashion. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, and as this is so much the more the case, the more the war has a bias that way, from the circumstances out of which it has arisen, the smaller its motives are and the excitement it has raised, so it is also conceivable how out of this calculation of probabilities even motives to peace may arise, right? So, in other words, it's what we have practically already said. We have when we are in war, we actually know what this is about. We try to observe fundamentally, but all the various movements that can influence on our motives to go on, right? And we are perfectly aware that we can kind of and hopefully at least go back and forth. I mean, that this fight could come to an end depending on the circumstances. This is not going to be forever. By the way, this fight is already an enormous exertion by itself, and there are so many little factors that can intervene, maybe just individually, but more often more combinedly, to put an end even to the fight. And then von Clausewitz goes on and says, war does not therefore always require to be fought out until one party is overthrown. Remember that the objective of war is to compel our enemy to the enemy to obey our will, right? So you're at that point in which you should, in the process, have him obliged to do so. The verb in German is niederwerfen, right? So literally throwing down, below. So it involves also this kind of let's say annihilation that can and does pass in war always through physical annihilation as well as moral annihilation. But here von Clausewitz is telling us that war to be won doesn't necessarily require that. That would be if, you know, that abstract conception of war existed. Turns out in reality it doesn't work this way, and you can play, as we will see now, on other elements that balance of calculation, right? Based on chance and on the value of the bet, fundamentally, that you can play on to make a conflict cease, right? Or even to be triggered, because at the end of the day you can even provoke the enemy to do something wrong. To there is this idea that especially the most bellicose side, I mean the one that has greater need to protract the war, is effectively the defending one, the one that lures in some way, not the attacker. The attacker is usually not the warmonger. He's the one that, on the contrary, wants peace to be reached kind of immediately, right? Because he's putting the wall of fort into the thing, so he has already planned out how everything should be, because he has seen the commencement of this war as something that should bring hopefully to an end with his victory. The defender is saying, okay, you attacked me, now I will show you what I'm capable of doing, and actually making less force. We're talking on average, but this is really how it is. That's the reason why, once again, attack is the weakest form of war, and with however the positive motive, and defense is the strongest form of war, but with the negative motive, because the first one, the attack, wishes for everything to end as soon as possible. The defender doesn't. The defender wants things to go on, and paradoxically, that's in fact what what the procrastinating the war brings to greater losses, right? We're talking always on average, but these are still the fundamentals on which the thing works. So, going on, where were we? Oh yeah, and we may suppose that when the motives and passions are slight, a weak probability will suffice to move that side to which it is unfavorable to give way. So this is perfectly clear, that it's as if there was a balance that is into which the fighters of a war are suspended, and this balance, this equilibrium, is extremely precarious. There is a tiny kind of a tiny element that can bring to this balance to lean either from one side or the other, right, and change effectively the direction of the war. Think of all wars that there is this kind of we will talk about von Clausewitz about the culminating point of the offensive, for example, is particularly important in all this process when we talk about the motives, the moral strengths, etc. And going on, von Clausewitz says, now where the other side convinced of this beforehand, it is natural that he would strive for this probability only, instead of first wasting time and effort in the attempt to achieve the total destruction of the enemy's army. So this is a very important phrase, because it introduces two things. First of all, the one we just said, that is, actually three. The first one is, the one we just said is about, it takes, if it takes that tiny bit to make your enemy desist from the fight, or at least to, depending on your motives as well, what you want this war to end like, you will basically concentrate your efforts just on that. Then there is this other concept that I'm noticing now, that is that if the enemy is convinced of this beforehand, right? So here von Clausewitz is still setting the ground, ideally to make us understand it a bit better. Let's assume this war starts, and there is therefore a before and an afterwards, and with fighting has this idea beforehand, that this awareness, this knowledge beforehand, that it takes the tiny bit to make his opponent desist, let's assume. Well, he will have kind of dealt with the thing, organized the war, concentrating the efforts on that specific tiny bit, to play on it, to make to defeat his enemy, right? The other one is, in fact, actually still part of the second, is the investment of the two fighters in real war on this kind of tiny probability to happen, at least to reinforce what the tiny bit that takes to intervene with all your forces, that you deem to be, I mean, not with all your forces, but with the forces that you deem to be expandable, in this purely, I mean, theoretically, purely economical calculation, in order to make the whole thing one. Excuse me. This is probably the third part that is actually the most important concept. That is that this doesn't take into account the achievement of the total destruction of the enemy. Here it talks about the enemy's army specifically, but actually just changing the enemy's mind. And this naturally depends at all times on what the motives are from your side as well from his side. So this is particularly important because you understand that in taking away the abstraction, real wars are most of the times fought just on this. That wars of annihilation are extremely rare. And even when they happen, they're still kind of grounded on, certain settlements and solutions that take into account that you don't literally have to annihilate in one shot all the enemy forces like an abstract war would be about. I mean, even the most devastating conflicts that we have had, historically speaking, were never quite aimed at that. I mean, I don't know any war in which literally until the last individual was slaughtered for the sake of it, the last building destroyed. It never happened like that, simply because war is restrained by these other many factors that intervene to condition it continuously, and at the same time, this is the same reason why the total war, this absolute destructive capabilities, are reduced by this kind of economical calculation of what is convenient at that point, because nobody has the need to literally destroy everything for no reason, or with just for the sake of annihilation. It's inconvenient economically speaking. It's not that you can't achieve annihilation. We can, as a matter of fact, but it's just not convenient. And the motives that lead to wars are, as von Clausewitz also recalls, war is never the product of a contingent reason, but it's a sum. It's actually a product of contingent reasons, but from not just one. It's not an isolated act that pops out like thinking pushing the red button and everybody's dead. We got very close to that in certain circumstances, but at the same time it didn't happen. And the reason why it didn't happen is that there were all these other things we care evidently about at stake, and that we didn't want to give up. And part of this still includes this what would be exchanged as for a humanitarian reason, actually, of not annihilating the enemy. It's not that there is a humanitarian reason like that. It's like a mere calculation. All we want is not, in fact, it's not convenient for the enemy to die for us. It's way better for us, the enemy, to work for us. Really, that's as simple as it is, and that's why it's very important also to have set those abstract, let's say, logic before in the first chapter, because von Clausewitz showed us that now quite clearly what it should be, and that abstraction is not completely undetached from reality, because it starts like that, then it gets modified in reality. But the motives that lead to us are exactly not that. Then you can be a psychopath in wanting everybody to die. But you see that even in the most ferocious totalitarian regimes, that never quite happened that way. It was still reduced, it was still regulated, it was still influenced politically, socially, and you can't really do without. So that millions of people can be killed, but at the same time, this depends mainly on your strength capabilities, not really on what the whole society would be about, unless the whole population wasn't made just of psychopaths. But in that case, I think that that group would get annihilated by itself much more quickly, even without having the time to start a war. So here, everything is grounded into realism, right? Von Clausewitz is a realist. Is not telling you that there are things that do not need to be. He's really telling you what happens. Then if you want to accept it, fine. That can be useful for you. If you don't, well, you're going to have serious problems with it. So first of all, it's important to set this right? So these fundamentals right. Then I lost myself in the text. I remember. Let me check. According to what we see in foregoing chapter, has rate. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we ended this. So von Clausewitz goes on and says, still more general in its influence on the resolution to peace is the consideration of the expenditure of... by the way, wait a second, I would like to focus the attention on another detail that I missed. Here, the total destruction of the enemy's army, right? I kind of digressed on the war of annihilation. It's kind of more total, but it's important that here von Clausewitz is putting the accent on the enemy army, because it tells you that carries with itself still the enemy combative capabilities. In the previous passage we had read in the other video, that the de facto, you really do not eliminate hostile feelings just by destroying an army, because that army is being sent by a government, by a people. So, but without the army, the enemy cannot fight, unless he doesn't, create another army, which can happen. But still, if you annihilate the enemy, most of the times, and this happens in military history, if you annihilate his armed forces, well, it's pretty complicated at that point for these people, unless he's not occupied and just left by himself, to recover strengths and to annihilate the enemy. Right, there can be a resistance, there can be certain political and social processes that brings to emancipation, to freedom, liberation, whatever you want to call it, but still it's, we talk strictly about war. Once the enemy is without his army, there is not much you can do. Of course, there are some kind of replenishment capabilities in every real scenario, of course, but once a whole armed forces of a country are annihilated, well, it's particularly complicated to go on, right, without another. But it still can happen. Always bear in mind that at the same time you may be have inflicted all those losses, for example, to the enemy, but having suffered as much as him, or even more. And at that point, the problem is not the sum of your armed forces, but also of your moral resources and of your motives. What did you go there for? That was the real point. I mean, by 1943, the Nazis and the Soviets go pretty close to peace, for example, because at that point, which was a kind of a strategical stalemate, the idea was, we go on fighting, killing other millions, as in fact it would happen once again, or we trying to spare us that thing, and you see there that the political element kind of we can't even say that Clausewitz, in Clausewitzian terms, that it kind of recovered the control, but it kind of became stronger towards the military action. Why? Because the motive of going on to fight at that point had reduced itself, and after all those enormous forces' strength, it had also exhausted the respective systems, right? So and that's the interesting thing. However, it didn't happen. So it's as if there was always this balance. That is what you have to play on. and not thinking about the annihilation of the enemy as a whole, but just convincing him to fulfill your will. And also in there, it's never so radical, it's never so absolute and complete. Especially if you haven't wiped out that enemy, militarily speaking, there is always someone you have to bargain with, and naturally now we will see that, of course, the peace conditions can definitely favor the one that has the greatest motive and the greatest strengths to spend at that point, but it's still, you can't do as if the other didn't exist. So it's always conditioned as, and never absolute as a result, right? And in fact, this is what here von Clausewitz says: still more in general, its influence on the resolution to peace is the consideration of the expenditure of force already made and further required. So the example I made before with the Nazis and the Soviets is brilliant in there, because that was hell of our right. Like that was an enormous amount of resources lost, millions of people exterminated, and to industrial systems that were exhausted, or at least they had this continuous effort required to the rest of the population. There were strong motives at that point, and from both sides, and yet, in fact, the war went on. So there's always this constant assessment. By the way, the expenditure of the force already made always influences you in even assessing what is the one further required, right? What it takes to, and that's why even having experience firsthand certain things makes you become much more concrete and real and rational than what you essentially don't know. That's why experience is so important, and why in military history that's always the first thing you should start from when you try to understand how a war may work, because that's an incredible in all human activities, the of war as a human activity is the field in which there is the highest benefit derived from experience, instead of theory. Theory just talking about something you don't know. It becomes pure extraction. This is what von Clausewitz always criticizes of his times, that especially the military wasn't thinking of getting real about what the real war should be and how it should be fought, but getting kind of the right formula, the right equation for winning the war in the most perfect way. This was kind of an optimistic and positivistic ideal that that instead it's what effectively makes things fail. You can't even consider World War the First as the end of of this positivistic ideal of the continuous progress of the perfect calculation that goes right, because after a few months of war everybody realized that they had messed up pretty seriously, and then they adapted to it, and that of course reconfirms in prospect the Clausewitzian paradigm as well. Then he goes on and says, as war is no act of blind passion, but is dominated by the political object, therefore the value of that object determines the measure of the sacrifices by which it is to be purchased. So it's extremely important. It's what we already said. Here it's very important that von Clausewitz stresses that war is no act of blind passion. Like people out there believe too frequently actually that war is just a bunch of primitive apes that get hyped and want to smash each other's skull, in that there is a sort of lust for war and for violence because humanity is inherently evil and all this stuff. War is not like that. War is not an act of blind passion. It is not. It doesn't work out like that. I mean, even if you were not to, this is not a moral judgment. It has nothing to do with that. Here, up to this point, von Clausewitz has demonstrated to you that it's not the case, because it couldn't be like that in the reality we live in. It's a problem, even a kind of a physical problem. It's not a matter of saying it's as if nobody knew that if you throw yourself from a skyscraper, you don't die. You see many people throwing themselves out of skyscrapers because they think everything is kind of blind passion. Why should be war the only blind passionate thing and not the rest? It turns out actually war is one of the least passionate things. It's something it's abstracted the most from the passional dimension. It's something reasoned and thought out. And if you look at how the military works, in fact, think about discipline. And the military is effectively the social element, we want to call it this way, that has this unique martial order that you don't find anywhere else into society. And guess why? Because the military is trained to deal with situations that where you really can't base yourself on imagination, things that you wish to interpret, because if you have to if you're exposed to enemy fire, there is not many things you can do differently from the ones that are in fact military history has taught us. And that's why discipline is so important, because discipline is often conceived like something gets stupidly or senselessly punished. And there is also a taste for this kind of dictatorial stuff. Obviously, just look at those corrupted and vicious military regimes that also supported dictatorships, etc. Well, this is kind of true, but that is mostly a political thing. It's not inherent to the military. The military has this other element, even a competitive one. What von Clausewitz identifies in gaming proper, in this attraction towards chance that therefore is not ideologically driven, but it's actually mathematically driven. If we want to really approximate this, and I mean, if we want, on the contrary, to be quite objective on what it is. So I don't remember what it was going with this. Oh yeah, that discipline has been believed during in fact, all this pacifism that denies, in fact, the Clausewitzian paradigm, and that is worryingly filtered in environments that are kind of didn't rationalize the passages it happened. But when I attack culturalism, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, if you believe in culturalism, you're inherently pacifist. There are no other many ways to put this, because if you believe that war is cultural, and therefore it just depends on whether you're a barbarian or not, whether you're bloodthirsty or not, you're inherently, first of all, denying a freaking lot about human biology and neuropsychology, and the most sound evidence we have, because it comes from science. But you're also basically making a very strongly moralistic judgment. You're basically saying it should be as I say, that there shouldn't be war because war is inherently bad. And this is an enormous mistake, because war is nothing but a mean. War in itself has no I mean, there is a freaking huge difference of killing a terrorist that wants to blow up hundreds of people with a gun and killing an innocent civilian with a gun. Here, what the only difference is not the gun. The gun is shooting and killing. The gun is just an instrument. What the difference is made, what's in the head of those people, and that's not military. That's political. That's ideological. The military, as an instrument, is neutral. That's then what's in the hand of the individual soldier, individual citizen, is what complicates the story, of course. But here, it complicates it in the practice of social life, of political life, not just in the military one. And that's because the military is an instrument and nothing else. That's straight. You see, there is no way you can escape from this. This is not something you can debate. This is how it works in reality. Unfortunately. So, continuing here, war is no act of blind passion. It is not. But it is dominated. Sculpt this verb into your mind. Dominated by the political object. This is what it is. War is politics. War is an act of policy. War is an act of policy by Clausewitzian definition. Therefore, quoting him, the value of that object determines the measure of the sacrifices by which it is to be purchased. In other words, human life has a cost. Yes, it has. And this doesn't mean that we can't conceive our lives as if, they had really the importance that we give to it, that it like thinking that is sacred, that it has. But we should ask ourselves in this sense, how to conjugate this with the reality, because the reality works in that way. What evolutionary biology, neurobiology, psychology, etc. tell us is that it doesn't matter what you believe or what you were taught when you were little, what kind of culture you belong to. If you are put in a certain condition of whatever, let's call it stress, you're able to transform yourself into a killer in 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Not more. Not less. 3 seconds can make the most peaceful person living on this earth, transforming him into a killer, because we are programmed genetically to behave like that. You can't decide it. And this doesn't mean that other beliefs are wrong. I mean, I believe personally that, if you read the Bible, or you have or you look also at other complex religious philosophical systems, you acknowledge that things like, or the original sin, are starting exactly from this acknowledgement. The idea that we are wicked in a part. Turns out, however, that this doesn't ruin things completely, that we can still do positive things. And this is what also science tells us perfectly. So, anthropologically speaking, you can't... judging humanity as irremediably evil, I believe, is an act of evil, morally speaking, by itself. Because there is still the possibility of redemption. No man is beyond redemption. And it takes to know how to do the right thing to be redeemed. And I would go as far to saying that Clausewitzian theory emerges from an extremely powerful philosophical underground, it's scientific underground. The Vom Kriege should be read, at least at light of 19th century philosophy, and obviously all what it came before. It's not something that emerges out of a calculator. It was written by a Prussian general of the 19th century with all his historical determination, if you want. So this should make us reflect, because this is another fellow human mind who produced this, and we ought better to listen to him, I believe, rather than dismissing it just because maybe it's fashionable, it makes you feel better, or just listen to him. Nobody tells you have to obey or to follow, but thinking about it, I think it's worth of the shot. Okay, so another important point here, he uses a beautiful word, sacrifice. War is sacrifice indeed. People get killed, so exactly, probably the greatest sacrifice you can require to an individual. the the term purchased. So you basically make a sacrifice, and you can interpret all this economically speaking. It's when you sell something important, let's assume, or something valuable in strictly economical terms. You say, we'll have done the right thing. Do you quite buy and sell everything at the same you think at the same exact price that you deem as fair, for instance? Well, it never happens, but still, life has to go on. You can't stop in there, counting up to the minimal cent to the last cent to say, okay, well, they have to calculate it purely, because otherwise maybe the person you were selling that thing gets tired, goes away, because in the meanwhile, even time has a cost. Just remember, time is probably the most precious resource that we have, so that's also important, and you can't stop it. This is also how the Clausewitzian theory has to be framed into, into the reality of the world, not into an abstraction. When you read von Clausewitz, you're not reading about a fantasy world, out there, abstract, imaginary. You are talking about reality, first and foremost. Also because von Clausewitz is not interested in anything else. When he talks about abstract objects, he is not... he's not stopping there. He is doing it, as we have seen about now, pretty well, just to bring you back into reality, to show you in other ways how crazy would it be to think otherwise from what the pragmatic nature of life is all about, if you really want to live on this earth, right? Okay, then he goes on and says, this will be the case not only as regards extent, but also as regards duration. Here, so the time that recurs once again. So this is important because, as we will see now, the kind of time is able to dilute the costs. This is also particularly important as a concept. Von Clausewitz says, as soon, therefore, as the required outlay becomes so great that the political object is no longer equal in value, the object must be given up and face will be the result. So there is always this this line that if you cross, it's not worth it anymore. It's worthless to fight. Well, of course, at that point, it's like when the tides turn into a war. People, one side understands they will be defeated. He will try to ask for a peaceful settlement, but sometimes actually that's the moment in which the other side will press on more powerfully, and that's actually a pretty logical thing to do, depending, however, always on the object. What your motives are. You may not want to do it, because after all, maybe you didn't start that war, you didn't want this, you already bled excessively, and you don't want to go on. You may want that. So this happens from both sides, and it often happens that peace results from the confrontation because both sides simply say, okay, this is not worth it. Then he says, we see, therefore, that in wars where one side cannot completely disarm the other, the motives to peace on both sides will rise or fall on each side according to the probability of future success and the required outlay. So this calculation, whether the thing is it's worth it or not, derives from this probability of future success in the required outlay on each side. So this is how they determine that. There is no other way, and you should always bear in mind what your foe is up to. Actually, most of the fights are about this. I mean, even when you go out there in the street and you start a brawl and you start punching, the problem, what you're really into is not really about the physical side. I mean, there are obviously people who are more cold-blooded and are able to maintain discipline, etc., but even the most trained special force operator under a certain amount of stress is just a human being, he will start using the assault rifle as a club, no matter how much he's been trained to use it properly, because that's how we are. That's the apes that we are. So this can vary, but what you're mostly concentrated on, and especially if you are the one who is in charge of the fight, that's why even the brawl is a kind of a at a cognitive level, especially, is a good example, because you are in charge of what you're doing. You're the only fighter there. You're the only physical person involved into the fight. You have your opponent there. So what you're calculating at that point is, what the hell is he doing now? Will he strike me back? You know, and you're trying to figure out, even I mean, both rationally and instinctively, some measures to make him stop fighting. It's not about killing him. Hopefully not. Also because you will go to jail, quite likely. But because you want him to stop. You don't really care. I mean, you're concentrated on it, and therefore this level of theoretical approach now that von Clausewitz is using is never to be disjointed from this idea that both the opponents are looking at each other constantly and seeing what happens, and there is this reciprocal interaction that we have seen in the first chapter that has always influence on one another, even if you don't want to, because that always changes what you're doing. And think about, you know, that's why politics, by the way, is always on the foreground, because you're not just punching a person, you're just thinking rationally how you ingeniously what you can do aside from punching to take him down, hopefully without punching too much to get exhausted, or risking to keep him be punched. You know, that's very logical. I mean, that's what I always say. The Clausewitzian thought is very limpid. Then he goes on and says, if these motives were equally strong on both sides, they would meet in the center of their political difference. So this is theoretical, very rare, but it's effective didactically speaking. So if imagine that the motives together with the strengths, I would say, are equally strong at this point on both sides, right? Well, at that point, it's not about fighting anymore. That's policy that takes over, like saying, okay, we are too strong one another. It's like during the Cold War. I mean, both the NATO and Warsaw Pact knew that they, were aware of their differences, but still, these were too mild given the destructive capabilities that they both had. And they said, okay, well, we're enemies. We're kind of fighting in other ways, proxy wars or etc. But we still don't strike each other, and that's a political choice. Because if it would have been mere military, they would have just annihilated each other. That's how ants reason, like seemingly. Well, the ants are pretty fascinating in the thing, in how they act. But the idea is that you had an ant. If if ants had nuclear weapons, the entire world would be destroyed in a few weeks. Well, we spent almost 50 years now in Cold War, and it turns out it didn't happen. So this is actually, I think, a recognition to human understanding, intelligence, rationality, no matter how weird or weak or corrupted the various sides could be. There is still an intelligence that supersedes all these petty differences, and by the way, which are not petty, by the way. There were big, ideological views of the world and how it should be run, etc. So they're not little, but it's as if humanity in its neutral value had prevailed at that point, saying, okay, do we want really to annihilate each other? We went pretty close to that, but it still didn't happen. I don't know whether we were particularly... There were at least a pair of times we went pretty close to that. Yet it didn't happen. So I think that great part of it stands not just into... it's not even it doesn't even want to be a compliment at this point, because there is a rational side, but there is also an instinctual side, including the instinct of survival that really does play a role. I mean, even the people who might have wanted to see their enemies wiped out of the face of the earth at that point, thinking, to be annihilated, to be seeing the air tempested by radiations and not being able to the whole social system collapse, would have said, okay, what the hell do I do in that situation? I don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want to wake me up tomorrow into a nuclear holocaust. So, well, that's what we'll try to avoid in a way or in another. Okay. So, and it's evident, by the way, that was historically speaking, like any historical reality, it was not a condition in which the motives were equally strong on both sides. Actually, there was someone who had more or less to lose in that case, right? So this is also important, because it means that this economical evaluation of reality is still something that is able to pay something for a major threat to go away, not to reason just coldly, right? Because otherwise it would have been it would have probably led to the disaster, I believe. Then let's see what it says. They would meet in the same, or maybe not. I don't know really. I don't know what about the last sentence, but it's still something to reflect on. But it would have not been real. This is the point I wanted to make. So where Von Clausewitz goes on, says where they are strong on one side, so the motives, they might be weak on the other. Always. No motive, first of all, is equal to another. Everybody has his own reason for starting a war, and it changes continuously in its during the fight, etc. If the amount of motives is only sufficient, peace will follow, but naturally to the advantage of that side which has the weakest motive for its conclusion. So here, in other words, there is one who has to give up, at least more than the other, right? So that at least the peace settlement will be less advantageous for him. And this is interesting because it can play on several levels. Like, even a much more powerful entity can sign a very unfavorable peace treaty, because maybe there is other stuff going on with other in other parts of his to which it interacts. So every war is, and every motive is effectively hiding in this niche of finding where, what's the weakest spot, and it's constantly evolving, so that the enemy can always be a step ahead of you if you don't stay sharp. Here then he says, we purposely pass over the difference which the positive and negative character of the political end must necessarily produce practically. For although that is, as we shall hereafter show, of the highest importance, still we are obliged to keep it here to a more general point of view, because the original political views in the course of the war change very much. Yes, they do, and at last may become totally different. And then it says, just because they are determined by results and probable events. So that's the phrase that this whole passage is about. Always remembering that the political views are determined by results and probable events. So a mix of things that you can more or less assess realistically, because by the way, even results, I mean, you think that, there are results that are more difficult to interpret than, to calculate and to understand, to acknowledge than probabilities. Have you ever thought about this? I mean, there are certain things that are pretty easy to do, even if they're still theoretical because you haven't transferred them in action, but still you're not aware of the results, how it will be like. And this is very important if you interpret it like, it's very easy to start a war, but it's definitely not easy to understand what that war will cause. And definitely some of the most important historical events have been triggered even by such thing. And this is not a prerogative of war, though. It's still about policy, as we have seen, as war is a political act, and it's still policy deciding that. But it all gets to policy, right? So let's repeat it once again. Political views are determined by results and probable events. They change very much. They can become totally different just because they are determined by results and probable events. Okay, so I think this was very interesting and useful. I'm glad we started, as I said last time, the second chapter of the first book. If you are confused, maybe you have missed the last video. I basically here there are not small paragraphs like in the first chapter, so we're going passage by passage, so you may have difficulties to find this into the Vom Kriege, but I think if you at the beginning of I could put the text at the beginning in the video description, but whatever. I think if you listen to the words, the phrases at the beginning where I read the text, you can Google that and it's pretty easy to find it. So, but it's all consequential. It's part 1, part 2, part 3, so that's how I split it. So for now, I hope that you appreciated this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me, as always. And I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.